paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
The truth.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. This week's guest will be psychiatrist Warwick Middleton. Warwick is a professor at the School of Medicine, University of Queensland, and is the director of the Trauma and Dissociation Unit at Belmont Hospital in New South Wales, Australia. Dr. Middleton is a former president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. And I should mention that Warwick is coming to us from Brisbane, Australia, where it's 5 a.m. And the last time I woke up before it was 5 a.m, I cut the tip of my nose shaving, which had never happened before. So I will never, ever shave before 5 o'clock. But here is Warwick. Warwick, it's good to see you.
It's good to see you, Nick. And just before we say anything further on the subject today, I should just congratulate you on the ISSTD Therese O. Clemens Advocacy Award, because it's a great recognition of your major contribution over many years as an investigative journalist. And I just, for your listeners, point out that the last two recipients of the award were Julia Gillard, who was Prime Minister of Australia, and Joe McCarthy, who, like yourself, is an intrepid investigative journalist whose work was pretty much the foundation of the Australian Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. So great company, and congratulations.
Well, thank you. And I am very grateful for the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation bestowing me with that award. And I've gained nothing but respect for that organization. And how are you doing today, Warwick?
I'm good, Nick. Don't have a lot else on at 5 a.m. in the morning, so it's nice to meet.
Well, you look kind of sprite at 5 a.m.
Yeah.
We eventually connected because you had read the Franklin scandal. And,
that is correct, yeah.
And you wrote me a letter, which I got kind of belatedly. And a number of therapists are fans of the Franklin scandal. Actually, I've got more therapists that are fans of the Franklin scandal than there are journalists that are fans of the Franklin scandal. And could you tell me why you had that interest in the Franklin scandal?
Well, our society has, since forever, had an undercurrent of organised abuse. And when you fast forward to what's happened in the world in the last couple of decades, we've seen a deluge of inquiries and royal commissions into elements of organised abuse and its cover-up. And I guess I'm very aware of something that Robert Fleiss, son of Wilhelm Fleiss, pointed out many years ago, that within our society there is a substantial number of people who he said had ambulatory psychosis, which is people who outwardly look totally respectable and don't trouble the populace in terms of their profile, and yet behind closed doors within their families or within institutions are heavily involved in abuse, and they in turn use institutions to cover up that abuse. I thought the Franklin scandal was just a meticulously researched book on high-level organised abuse involving all the elements of power in society. We just see that within political parties, the judiciary, the police, and in that case, even within journalism, that we have those coming together about keeping secret things that have been always happening in our society. And I guess coinciding with the Franklin scandal, there have been a substantial number of other elements of organised abuse that came to global consciousness. And I guess one of the hooks too, Nick, is that I, long time ago, in becoming involved in the study and treatment of people with dissociative disorders, became aware that for a substantial percentage of that group, the abuse never ends. We had this concept. It took a long time for society to get to a stage of even accepting that incest, for example, was a large-scale problem in all societies. But having got finally to something of an acknowledgement of that, we had not acknowledged the fact that for a substantial proportion of victims, the incest never ends. It goes on for decades through adulthood. And again, it's another one of those elements of something that is abusive within society that we had not allowed ourselves to be aware of, the things that we did not want to know, in fact. And I guess when I became involved in studying DID, I was aware from very early on that for a substantial group percentage that the abuse never ended, and for those where it never ended, almost invariably the abuse extended to include some form of organised abuse, whether it be prostitution, whether it be workmates, whether it be religious cults, religions, etc. It seems to be that there's something about humanity, whether it's supporting soccer clubs or collecting stamps, that people get together and organise and do it together and set up networks to facilitate whatever activity it is. Some of it may be very innocent. We're just very social animals, but some of it's, as we've seen from the rise of organised abuse using the internet, the numbers involved are just sort of staggering. And when I think the FBI closed down Playpen some years ago as an internet-related online child exploitation site, we're talking about the best part of 250,000 people had logged on to that site. So I thought the Franklin scandal, 7 years researching it, and it stood the test of time in that when you write about major political parties, figures, people involved with or known to presidents, etc., you're touching dangerous waters in terms of reporting. So unless your reporting is extraordinarily accurate and you've double-checked multiple sources for every statement you make, you're in legal jeopardy. And the test of the Franklin scandal is the fact that, of course, Nick, you're still here. No one's sued you or shot you yet. So.
Here I am. Well, yeah. It's very interesting. Boys Town is very litigious, and I found a number of Boys Town victims that had been abused by Lawrence E. King and that network, and Boys Town has never come after me, and I think that is because they couldn't handle the discovery and if there was a litigation. And what's interesting is child abuse, according to the CDC, our CDC, and I think that they have a tendency to be cautious. The number that they say that 25% of women will be abused as minors. And if you extrapolate those numbers out, there are millions and millions of American women that have been abused as minors. Yeah,
that's the sort of figures that multiple studies sort of come up with in that ballpark. And by the way, the fact that about a quarter of American women have been sexually abused as children was something that was known back in the 40s, and it was a finding of the Kinsley studies, which was focused not on abuse, but it was focused on sexual behaviors. So he had a different mission, but nevertheless, the background information has always been there, but society just wasn't ready to do anything with it. I mean, it's interesting, Nick, that with I guess a revolution in awareness that began in the 70s and then sort of accelerated into the 80s. We began to get, real world figures for the extent of, for example, child sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse and neglect, etc. And quite a number of studies looked at, the average mental health patient, whether they were an inpatient or an outpatient. And it became very apparent that if you take all patients, who present for whatever reason and are conceptualized in whatever model, if you take a fine-grained history of their childhood, that you'll find that about 2/3 have been physically and or sexually abused as children. Then if you add in emotional abuse and neglect, you find that about 80% of all mental health patients have a history of some form of a major childhood trauma or neglect. It's sort of interesting, Nick, when I started in psychiatry in 1980, which is a bit of a watershed year because it was the year in which DSM-3 was published and brought with it operationalized criteria for the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and for what was then called multiple personality disorder. But in that year also, there was published this monolithic 3-volume text, this most widely used text in psychiatry, the comprehensive textbook of psychiatry edited by Friedman, Kaplan and Sadok. And if you looked up the index somewhere at about page 2000, there's a couple of pages, little more than a few paragraphs on incest. And the most up-to-date reference used to comment on the prevalence of incest in 1980 in America was a paper from 1955, and it gave an estimate of incest as occurring in about 1 in a million American women. And that says something about the culture that we were living in, and that was the culture that I started training in. We now know, like within 6 years, Diana Russell had published a detailed book on the epidemiology, of sexual abuse in a population, a contemporary American population, and found that the prevalence of incest was about 160,000 per million, which is a bit of a difference.
Indeed. In my first two, my first 3 podcasts, I looked at the Franklin Network, and then I looked at the Epstein Network, and then I also looked at the Finders, and all 3 were engaged in extreme abuse of children, and all those 3 networks. And once children become really severely abused at a young age, you had talked about it, they develop dissociative identity disorder, which was, as you said before, was called multiple personality disorder. So could you give us an overview of DID and what it's like working with patients that have DID?
Well, dissociative identity disorder is just a condition that's at one end of the spectrum of psychological trauma responses, and it involves dissociation, which in simple terms is a disruption in the usually integrated processes of consciousness, memory, identity, and perception. It's like having parallel circuits within an organization, and suddenly you take some of them offline, or it's like having, taking a computer system and suddenly you're putting locks on files within an organization, which is that person. And dissociation is a way of trying to survive things that are otherwise overwhelming by compartmentalizing memories or feelings or functions. There's nothing magical or mysterious about it. People with DID are humans. They have the same range of human emotions and talents and personal qualities that other people have. But they've been conditioned by abuse, and as a child, when you've got something that's happening to you on a repetitive nature, and you've got no actually insight into an alternative way of life. I mean, the average age, the most common age at which child sexual abuse starts, as far as we know, is about the age of 3. So take a 3-year-old, put them in a position where they're being abused regularly, several times a week, and at a real level, they have got nowhere to go. They have no concept as a fully formed identity of what life's about or what alternative existence would look like. At some level, they just respond to something that is inescapable by being somewhere else. They go into the teddy bear sitting on the shelf. Suddenly they're out of their body, as it were. And we're dealing with children who have a natural propensity to, or normal children, to imaginatively take on, in a fun sort of way, identities or have imaginary friends and stuff like that. But, with somebody exposed to unremitting abuse, the dissociation compartmentalizes trauma or the feelings that go with it and into states that over time become more materialized as identities. The interesting thing about DID is that the average patient with DID at the time of presentation doesn't know that they have DID. It's only a relatively small number who realise and self-diagnose. Most of them know there's something wrong but can't explain it. So, and in fact, what they do is they dissociate the fact that they dissociate. And we see people with DID across the full spectrum of society. You see it from any grouping, and particularly one sees a higher than average proportion of people represented in the health profession. So when I and my colleague Jeremy Butler published the first series on DID in the Australian scientific literature back now, almost a quarter of a century ago, one of the interesting sort of findings was that of the 62 people who we described and who had been collected in no organised way other than for the fact that for whatever reason we had reason to assess them in the normal course of doing psychiatry, an interesting finding was that no less than 34% of that group were or had been some form of health professional. So at some sort of intrapsychic level, there is something about being traumatized that makes a more than average likelihood that you'll be drawn to working within the health professions, so nurses, psychologists, doctors, etc.
What's really interesting is that by the time someone is diagnosed with DID, they've seen probably multiple mental health professionals.
Yes.
They've been given different diagnoses like bipolar or
that's right,
personality disorder. So how do you hone in on that and see and actually diagnose DID in someone who's had multiple, who's been stamped with multiple psychiatric labels?
Well, actually, the multiple psychiatric labels is almost a diagnostic clue in itself, Nick. If you find a patient who's had multiple psychiatric diagnoses, multiple treatments, and has never improved, and who hears voices and is already on clozapine, presumably for sort of non-responsive schizophrenia, then there's a fair chance that you're pretty close to something like DID. If they also come with a history of severe child abuse and or large elements of amnesia, then that makes it more and more likely. I mean, the paradox of it is, Nick, look, when it is DID in one sense, is a hidden disorder because the person with it doesn't proclaim they've got it generally, and it's about not knowing. The disorder is about not knowing stuff. It's in order to survive. So it's got an internal mechanism that goes to the point of denying its existence to the self and to others. And I can sort of, in slightly amusingly, sort of tell you a couple of like responses of people in that state. I can remember a patient vehemently looking at me and saying, "I'm not multiple, but I think some of the others are." which actually speaks to the dual reality. It's sort of in one sentence, exactly. That's what, or looking at me and saying, we are not multiple. And yet inherently within the answer is the fact that they realize at some unconscious level that they are multiple. Hence they're incorporating in their answer the plural. But one of the paradoxes with DID is, of course, in order to diagnose this, you've got to be aware that it's actually a relatively common condition. And you mentioned the way in which it gets misdiagnosed, and when we did our study back in and published it in 1998 on 62 individuals with DID, the average amount of time that one of those people had been bouncing around the mental health system in Australia before diagnosis was nearly 12 years. So it speaks to the fact that these people know there's something wrong and frequently come to the attention of mental health, but that the system, it's certainly back in those days, was just ill-equipped to even recognise that this was a widespread condition. And that, that issue in Australia was the same issue that had arisen in every other country where there was an emerging awareness about incest, child abuse, organised abuse. And in turn, we began to uncover those that had survived one way or another psychologically. And in that grouping, of course, is those with DID. In our study back in 1998, published then in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry, it's sort of indicative that I think some 29% of that group had been aware that at some stage they'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia. About 20% had been diagnosed at some stage with bipolar disorder, and had been at some stage on lithium medication. Again, congruent with the diagnosis of schizophrenia, a relevant percentage had been on antipsychotic medication. And of course, within this group, you have, high indices of self-harm, suicidality, contact with mental health providers, etc. When I first diagnosed openly, individuals with DID, I was probably at that stage, back in very early 90s, the only person that I knew of within the entire sort of public mental health system that was openly diagnosing such individuals within, a major teaching hospital, which is kind of, I know what it's sort of like, Nick, to be feeling in a bit of rarefied environment.
I've never thought of myself as rarefied, but I guess that's as good as
yeah. But I didn't get my phone tapped, and I didn't get death threats or anything like that, Nick. And in actual fact, one can get all sorts of emotional reactions to realizing that, a substantial part of psychiatry involves people such as this, which up until then, and, in some cases still, not particularly well understood. I guess I've always made practice of, trying to work with the system, trying to be educative, support organisations that do research and provide educational opportunities for colleagues, and being open to colleagues to discuss such individuals. I've seen some people within, the trauma field, I guess, react to their sort of horror that the rest of the world doesn't get it, and, be openly critical of, colleagues for not getting it. And of course, as you know, as soon as you attack people, the standard response is to gather forces together and counterattack. It's not, you don't convince people by banging their heads usually. It's much more convincing if you be, kind and accepting and do your best to do good clinical work, relevant research, and to be open and available to talk about it. like I'm doing with you, Nick, and anyone else who's listening.
So you've diagnosed someone with multiple personality disorder. They have multiple alters.
Yeah.
So do you go for, I mean, is the goal of psychiatry at that point integration, or just creating a system where the alters can communicate with each other? Or...
Well, it's like all sort of discordant, social groupings within the world. What you're trying to do with, a group that to some degree are hidden or some degree are at war with each other. It's a way in which, the person has established, in a sense, some sort of line of control, like sort of Ukraine. They've got to a point where, for many, one part is balanced by another, and one usually finds that the parts that contain the most difficult knowledge or memories are those that are shunned by the rest, because it makes a lot of sense. If you don't want to trip over something that's going to be overwhelming, you put that material memory or function or feeling into a functional biohazard bag, and everyone avoids them. That's how you deal with stuff. And what you're doing, it's a bit like trying to facilitate a accepted communal grouping where all parts, a big issue, all parts are treated equally, and everyone has the opportunity to be heard. I think Rick Clough, who has treated more people with DID than anyone in human history, he helpfully described DID as that condition, in mental health, that is soluble in empathy. People with DID respond to being heard and validated. Guess what? They're no different from humans. In general, we all respond to being heard and validated. And for some people move to more integrated functioning. That as they process things, they have less and less need for internal barriers, and a complicated, closed system becomes just more like an open access office system, where everyone has access to the same memory files, for example. That, it becomes more complicated when everyone has their own, computer in locked room with their own code, and trying to get a decision made in such a circumstance is kind of more difficult than if you can access, all relevant memories and come up with a decision. So some people do become integrated, others move to just more functional, collaborative, more safe functioning. And when one meets people with DID for the first time, it may well be that they're in a state of crisis. And many, as I said, most of them have substantial history of suicidality, for example. And when you understand where they came from, it makes a lot of sense. In terms of diagnosing it, Nick, you mentioned, how easy it is. Sometimes I'm just thinking of one particular person I know who I've now known for over 30 years, for God's sake. Probably diagnosed it within about 90 seconds. But the diagnosis was the easy part. But she'd also be, as much as one can quantify these things, the most abused person I've ever met, in terms of the number of abuses, the duration of the abuse, the number of episodes of abuse, etc., etc. And she's one of those within that spectrum that I was mentioning, where the abuse was and had been ongoing, involved the father for decades. Even despite the fact that she was married with children, the abuse continued, and not only involved the father, but involved groupings associated with the father, who I've met, by the way, many years ago. And it's sort of interesting. He gave this elaborate story about how, he'd formed the belief that his son-in-law was an abuser and he was abusing his grandchildren, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, I let him go on for about an hour. And when you get to the obvious question is, well, you as the concerned grandfather, what have you done about reporting this or protecting them? Then suddenly interview terminated and he left. And the one time I spoke to him again, he denied that we'd ever spoken. So you get a sense of what it must be like living in a family where most objective reality is just repeatedly denied.
I was wondering, so you said that there are alters that are kind of kept away from other alters, probably
That's right.
alters that have experienced extreme abuse. And what happens when you ultimately come across one of those alters that has been hidden deep within the other alters? Is there any kind of commonality with that, or how do patients react?
Well, some are afraid that, if so-and-so, that part ever comes out, that sort of it's going to be overwhelming. And one is just patient. You just say, well, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to access that part until, everyone feels that that can be safely done. And we may say that the first time that they speak directly in an invited way, that we're not going to do anything other than say hello and exchange pleasantries, just so they get a feel for being able to be safely able to communicate, but also reinforcing for everyone else that they are important and given particular importance, that the fact that they have been the part that has had to carry the worst of, for example, memories and functions, or they're the one that, when you're dealing with DID, we're dealing with people who've carried enormous amount of shame, fear, and have been conditioned, from the earliest of childhood. When you put together shame, fear, and conditioning, you have all the elements necessary to keep an abuse survivor silent. So, these people, vast majority don't rush off to the police. And when you're dealing with those where the abuse is particularly ongoing, there's a very complicated attachment dynamic to the abuser. One hand, parts of them want to escape and may want to kill them, and others, reach out in this weird way, in a switch state, to be receptive to the ongoing abuse, which messes with one's head. If you look at the average sort of childhood of the average person with DID, it's a childhood filled with people that couldn't be trusted, and a feeling that one was never safe. It's an interesting exercise when talking with people that have got substantial dissociative phenomena, and where the abuse is ongoing, and it's just so hard to find within that entire family grouping anyone who is vaguely caring and normal. I remember, just to exemplify the point, I remember asking someone who just had terrible history of abuse, and where the father, as usual, involved multiple groupings within the family and outside the family who also involved in the abuse, and yet there were parts created that immediately any authority set out to do a child safety raid on the house or police raid or whatever, would immediately, in a switch state, ring the father and warn him that the authorities were coming. So and this person had a history of just multiple serious suicide attempts, and excess of 100 mental health admissions long before they were diagnosed with DID. I remember asking this person, and seriously, can you think? By the way, it was a family in which, it was very hard to distinguish who was a half brother, who was a half cousin, because, there was so much, so much incestuous activity and unusual parenthood, put it that way. So when I asked her, is there anyone you can think of in your extended family who you consider normal? She thought for a while and she said, oh, well, there was one person. I thought, well, that's promising. And who who was that? And she said, oh, you know, it was my maternal grandmother. But then she added, oh, but they murdered her. So
or maternal love.
Yeah, I know. And that's something else you find with DID is just within the network, you know, of their life, just how many people die from unnatural causes, you know, in murders, accidents, suicides, etc.
We exchanged some emails about Jeffrey Masson wrote a book.
Yeah.
And
1984.
Yeah. Assault on Truth. And it was essentially about how Sigmund Freud set back DID, or the diagnosis of DID, decades. Would you like to talk about that?
You know, the entry point for Sigmund Freud is pretty similar to the entry point for, you know, the modern dissociative disorders field. You know, both were encountering highly dissociative, traumatized individuals, and at a time in a world where in Freud's case, such individuals were pejoratively labeled as hysterics, bringing with it that they weren't an object of serious medical inquiry, and they were considered to be, you know, a group that had bizarre symptoms and were not taken seriously by mainstream medicine. And when you look at the group of individuals that the modern dissociative disorders field started seriously engaging with in the 70s, you know, you had a similar group, but had different labels by this time. They were labeled with things like borderline personality. And at that stage, the literature did not include, you know, the strong association between borderline personality disorder, so-called, and a history of childhood sexual abuse. And Freud in 1896 presented his findings on the etiology of hysteria to his colleagues in Vienna, which he was essentially saying that hysteria, which we would now consider as a complex trauma syndrome, including issues to do with, you know, dissociation, amnesia, somatization, conversion symptoms, post-traumatic symptoms, etc. Freud considered that condition for the first time, really, for anyone in the world, had publicly stated that a theory that hysteria was caused by childhood sexual abuse occurring at an early age, usually before the age of 8, in an ongoing way, which is pretty much what we see with DID. And if you read, you know, Freud's early case studies, you see accounts of, you know, such individuals switching. In fact, Joseph Breuer's famous case of Bertha Pappenheim, who became famous as a patient as Anna O, was someone who clearly had DID, who switched between different identity states, had amnesias, and where it was noted that there were marked differences in one state compared to another, who never married, who had a complicated relationship with her dying father and a complicated relationship with her mother, such that in a sanitarium, you know, when her mother was visiting, you know, she'd smashed glass and was slashing her wrists. Sort of behaviors that we associate with someone in that spectrum. Freud, I might add, at that time was also treating the daughters of a number of his medical colleagues for hysteria. No surprise that his theory did not gain a lot of support from his medical colleagues. And I mentioned Robert Fleiss, Freud's closest male friend in his entire life for a long period of time, about 16 years, was Wilhelm Fleiss, this eccentric Berlin-based ENT surgeon who had this somewhat wacky theory about male periodicity, the male equivalent of the female menstrual cycle. And he and Freud communicated avidly for many years. And it was with Fleiss that Freud discussed his theories, and from September 1897 began to retreat from his own theory about the etiology of hysteria, and over time effectively replaced it with the theory of Oedipal fantasy, so that women, and women particularly, were not being sexually abused by their fathers and family members, but in fact, they just had fantasies about being abused, that they hadn't really been abused. And it's curious because you know, if you look at Freud's writings, even for that period, he was describing corroborated accounts of incestuous abuse, where he'd, in some occasions, interviewed more than one participant or witness to the events that had been described. And it was not on the basis of any new evidence that he began to retract his original theory. And of course, he became more socially acceptable once he'd retracted a theory that said that a large percentage of the male population, for example, was sexually abusing their children. And as I said before, you know, when we look at Diana Russell's findings and the ones that you quoted, we're now looking, you know, at contemporary figures, you know, up 20 to 25% of females being sexually abused as children. So what Freud was encountering back in the 1890s was probably pretty much in line with what society experiences, you know, to this present day. And once Freud, it's fascinating sort of way in which, you know, it was seized upon that, you know, that hysterical mendacity and Oedipal fantasy became sort of cornerstones of psychoanalytic theory, and down the decades, orthodox psychoanalysis emphasized such purported activity, and Masson, or probably called Mason. It's just that it's spelt Masson.
I don't know if it's Masson or Mason.
It is Mason, because I know Jeff quite well. So, but having read his books from, you know, when they first came out in 1984, I'd always called him Masson. So he forgives me for that, I guess. But it actually.
It has a French flair to it. So
it does. And Jeff became the director of the Freud archives at an early age because of his close relationship with Kurt Eisler, the then doyen of American psychoanalysis, and then found himself in a position where he had access to Freud's unpublished papers, and he had formed something of a friendship with Freud's daughter, Anna, which also gave him access. And the one paper that particularly interested Masson was the September 1897 paper, in which Freud wrote to his wacky friend Wilhelm Fleiss about essentially the beginning of his retraction of his so-called seduction theory, that hysteria was caused by child sexual abuse. And over time, of course, psychoanalysis became an international body, and particularly propagated by people like Ernest Jones, who became, I guess, he was like the St. Paul the Apostle was to Jesus in terms of propagation of Christianity. Jones propagated psychoanalysis and, you know, had a major role in establishing psychoanalysis in the US, Canada, Great Britain, etc. And the weird twist to Jones is that he seemed to be much hated, even within psychoanalysis. And we now know that it's highly likely that he himself was a child sex abuser, and that he was arrested back in 1906 over the alleged sexual abuse of 4 children in a school for the disabled. And in those days, it was just sort of impossible for a conviction to be made where you had disabled children in a court. there were clearly multiple sexual boundary issues with Jones down the years. And psychoanalysis in its early practitioners was a boundaryless morass. There were just, no one had really defined appropriate therapeutic boundaries. So there were endless examples of analysts analysing their own children or getting involved in major conflicts of interest. Freud himself psychoanalysed his daughter Anna, and he was one of quite a number who did. And we've got to realise that, you know, within early psychoanalysis, there was they're obviously bright, innovative thinkers, but at the same time, there were obviously many who carried significant psychopathology. And when one looks closely at the early psychoanalysts, I could find that at least 10 of the early analysts died by suicide, including 3 who had been personally analysed by Freud. Some in spectacular ways, like Victor Tausk, who was one of the brightest of the early analysts, who was due to be married to his fiancée, who was also his ex-patient, and then wrote a letter both to Freud and to his fiancée, sort of hung himself with a curtain cord over a rafter and shot himself through the head. And yet psychoanalysis just shut that down for decades, any mention of what had happened. And Anna Freud herself, analysed effectively her own stepchildren, the children of Dorothy Burlingham, who grew up in her household, and one of whom, sort of in the late 70s, suicided in her house while she was continuing decades of therapy with Anna. Again, those sort of things would be sort of career-ending sort of boundary violations today, but did not attract a lot of attention back in the day. And it was sort of in the early 1930s, Sandor Ferenczi essentially attacked the Freudian notion of Oedipal fantasy by virtue of the fact that he himself, Ferenczi, like so many of the early analysts, had been sexually abused as a child, and he had been abused by his mother and by his nursemaid. And then he realised that the people he was psychoanalyzing were people such as himself, abuse victims. And he then challenged Freud and psychoanalysis by repudiating Freud's repudiation of the seduction theory. For his efforts, by that stage he was unwell with pernicious anemia, and Ernest Jones sort of wrote him into history as a psychotic man who was a sad end to a career that went wrong at the end. In fact, there's nothing about what he wrote at the end that doesn't sound totally cogent. And it's interesting that Freud's one-time friend, Wilhelm Fliess's son, Robert himself became a psychoanalyst, and in the late 20s visited Freud and discussed his disturbed father, the one he described as having ambulatory psychosis, which you remember was someone who outwardly in society appeared eminently respectable, yet behind closed doors was a sadistic, abusive tyrant. And that was the description that one can easily be inferred from Robert's writings and was corroborated by Robert's wife. Robert Fleiss, again, had a similar sort of fate to Ferenczi. He wrote about his challenge to Freudian orthodoxy, and again he challenged the seduction theory and pointed out that, you know, so many of the patients, and indeed many of the analysts themselves, had families that involved severe abuse. He was marginalised and he died in 1970. And then it was Mason, who by that stage had originally gone to see Anna Freud to discuss the Holocaust with her, and was surprised that Anna had little real interest in actual trauma, was much more interested in fantasy. And when he became the curator of the Freud archives, then developed this relationship with Anna, had access then to unpublished passages from Freud's letters. And these were incorporated in the book that you mentioned, The Assault on Truth, Freud's Suppression of the Seduction Theory, which became, the most controversial book in psychoanalysis in the last century. It was just created and rage from so many analysts who sort of piled on themselves to write vitriolic reviews of Masson's book. And there was one analyst, Bennett Simon, in the US, who was also enraged that, Masson could publish this stuff, attacking Freud, calling him a coward for retreating from his own theory. And, but he did something that no other analyst did. Bennett decided to objectively test what Masson had said. And Bennett went through the entire psychoanalytic literature, including everything that Freud had ever written, trying to find an example of someone who had presented with an Oedipal fantasy and then through psychoanalysis had been cured of their fantasy. And in the entire history of psychoanalysis up to that point, he could find no example, which is extraordinary that you have, best part of a century of work devoted to a theory for which one can find no example that's verifiable. And Mason talked about his analytic training, where he was told that you will encounter women who will claim that they've been sexually abused and that this fantasy is something that you will deal with in your therapy. Mason probably wasn't equipped, as he's probably said, to, that's our dog in the background.
This paper that you wrote in 2016.
Yep.
Where basically it was published in the Journal of Trauma, and it basically delineated how the cadre around Freud had either been sexually abused or were themselves abusers. And the argument can be made, and as you made it, that Freud retreated from the seduction theory because he didn't want to make his friends angry. I mean, I think that you can almost boil it down to that.
Yeah. I think when he initially started to retreat, it wasn't on the basis of any new evidence. He had no patient where he could prove that their abuse was a fantasy. One can't help but remark on the fact that by that stage, he was feeling ostracized. He'd put forward a theory that went down like a damp squid. None of his Viennese medical colleagues wanted to subscribe to it. You've got to remember that Freud was treating some of their daughters, which, think about it, what would that mean? And they stopped referring him patients. So from an economic and professional point of view, it made a lot of sense, whether it happened consciously or unconsciously, for him to retreat from a theory that was career-threatening and very unpopular, and kind of convenient that he could come up with another theory that explained away the problem of people reporting child sexual abuse. And then he used that as the royal road to the unconscious, that it opened the way to exploring the fantasy life of children, et cetera, which became a cornerstone of psychoanalysis. But getting back to the point, I find it fascinating that so many of the early analysts, including Freud himself, were abused as children, and yet came together around a theory that de-emphasized abuse. Not an uncommon dynamic, where one comes across health professionals, in recent times, who have come together, as professions, like delving with mental health, but at the same time doing it from a vantage point that denies their own abuse. The people that we know that, for example, that were sexually abused as children in the early history of psychoanalysis include Freud, who was sexually abused by his nanny, Carl Jung, who was sexually abused by a priest, Otto Rank, another very important person close to Freud and part of Freud's secret committee to uphold psychoanalysis and defend him from detractors, had been sexually abused as a child. He never revealed by whom, but spoke, tellingly about the devastating effect it had on his life. And of course, Sandor Ferenczi, who was the person that in all of history, Freud wrote the most letters to. and he had been sexually abused by his mother and his nanny. And then when one looks at the behaviour of some of the early analysts, I mean, many of them had bizarre childhoods and boundaryless practices. Wilhelm Reich had been exposed to, incestuous behaviour by his mother from an early age. He was exposed to, suicide, war trauma, and at a young age found himself like in Vienna practicing psychoanalysis, and had sex with the first patient he ever had, and who then died by suicide, with the claim being that he had made her pregnant, had been involved in a botched backyard abortion from which she died. The mother accused him of this, and then the mother in turn of his ex-patient, dead patient, then suicided herself. And, as I mentioned, 3 of the early analysts ultimately suicided, 3 who had, not from a large number, because of that group, 3 had been analysed by Freud herself, and there was another, Paul Verdern, who had been carried out a close self-analysis under the supervision of Freud. So that means 4 of that 10 had been analysed by Freud or had conducted self-analysis under the supervision of Freud, which means that a pretty large proportion of early analysts, because there weren't that many, obviously had some pretty significant mental health issues. And of course, there were those who had drug and alcohol problems, etc. And so that was the background that Mason inherited when he published his book, The Assault on Truth. And boy, was the reaction negative. And just about every analyst that piled on wrote a review, wrote a highly negative, inflammatory review, except that from within the trauma field, Judith Herman thought it was a great book. And in the early days of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, back in 1983, in the newsletter, there was published a short review, a very favourable review of Mason's book. By the way, the book has gone on to sell something like 40,000 copies, which is kind of interesting for a failed book. And the interesting thing is, of course, that everything that Mason said, about the true nature of the the high incidence of sexual abuse in the history of people in psychoanalysis has been borne out by what we have now been exposed to in terms of widespread national inquiries, church inquiries into the prevalence and extent of child sexual abuse. Mason, went on to, he was so attacked within psychoanalysis that basically he got out of it and moved to the other side of the world, and then started a new career writing about the emotional life of animals. Just at this moment, as you know, I've been negotiating with Jeff about a new book that looks afresh at the Assault on Truth, but incorporates commentaries and perspectives from a wide range of writers and clinicians from the modern world, looking at the issues brought forward by Jeff's book, and where our world sits with the issues of child abuse, dissociative disorders, etc. That would be, Jeff's he's now 81. By the way, one of the closest friends of Jeff has been Daniel Epstein of the Pentagon Papers. So, both of which, have had a lot of experience with carrying uncomfortable truths forward.
What I find fascinating, I looked into Wilhelm Reich years ago, and he developed he said that there was a mystical power called orgone, and he took the libido theory of Freud a couple bridges way too far.
Yeah.
And he developed orgone accumulators that were just, and they were just basically sheet metal, and
Yeah.
I mean, it was nothing. And he said that they would shrink tumors, and the FDA didn't see it that way. That and actually, he was put in jail for being a medical fraud. He thought that like the average man would come running to him because he was solving their health ills, but as it turned out, the average man did not run to him and treat him as a savior for their health. And then he wrote a book called "Listen, Little Man." So I think he was very upset with the masses at that point.
I think he's the only person in history who managed to be expelled both from the International Association of Psychoanalysis and the International Communist Party. So it was, and by the way, with his orgone accumulator, just in case you were wondering, he devised a finding that the color of libido was actually blue. In fact, when he died in custody and put there by the FDA because he was transporting medical devices across state lines without a license, I think by the time he died, I think he was actually like mad, whatever he'd started out as being, and he was obviously very disturbed in terms of his boundaries, but also brilliant. By the time he ended up dying, he was like psychotic. But an interesting story, and his childhood is one of substantial trauma and abuse. And his father, I think, suicided. He escaped, the advancing Russian army in World War I, barely, and lived through the horrors of World War I, and then ended up in Vienna after the war, and had this multiple scandals involving him being sexually involved with patients, which was so common. And Ernest Jones was another, who was boundaryless. And in fact, Ernest Jones had been dismissed as a resident from a hospital due to, disciplinary infractions, but became, the official biographer of Freud, and had wrote a glowing account of himself in the dust cover of the official history, as you might expect.
So you, unfortunately, psychiatrists and therapists that work with DID have been assaulted. Not only did Freud set your field back, but there was a group called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation.
Yeah.
That developed false memory panic. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. One of my good friends is Jennifer Freud, who is the daughter of Pamela and Peter Freud, who, along with Halida Wakefield and Rolf Unterweger, established in Philadelphia the False Memory Syndrome Foundation in 1992. And Jennifer's issue was something that she'd never in a million years expected to become a public issue. And it was made public by her mother, who went out of her way in a thinly disguised way to write about her daughter and her daughter accusing the father, Peter, of sexual abuse, all of which is now sort of on the public record. And Jennifer in no way ever expected anything to do with her therapy to come into the public domain, which was put there by her mother, who not only put it there, but established an international movement to support this notion that, that people were creating false memories, that therapists were implanting memories, that an amazing amount of stuff was sort of projected onto therapists, for which there was little evidence. There were some therapists, as you expect in any field, unfortunately, who stray from accepted boundaries. And one of the issues in this complex field is that there are some patients, a percentage of patients, who do incorporate things that are historically untrue into their accounts. And one of the challenges of that is that they tend to be the patients who are most traumatized. For those who incorporate things that are historically untrue, they also tend to be in the patients who experience most of the true traumas. Sort of interesting. And at the time, as now, there's always been some undercurrent belief of some terrible group within society who are indulging in some horrible, organized abuse, be it, satanic ritual abuse back in the 80s, or be it QAnon in our current world, where just amazing stuff is being projected onto this semi-mythical group of QAnon led by some unidentifiable person who, propagates releases of information that's seized on, but unfortunately in your country, by people who are actually elected to Parliament.
Actually, we have a Senate and a House here, but it's analogous to Parliament.
Yeah, whatever you call it.
What amazes me is you talked about the 4 founders of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. One was a child molester, and one was a theologian who said that pedophilia was God's will.
Yeah.
What amazes me about that organization is it's all you have to do is scratch below the surface, and you'll just see an unbelievable amount of obfuscation and lies. But it gained such traction in the United States of America. The New Yorker wrote a laudatory article on some of the people in the false memory syndrome, and Frontline did a 2-part series that was laudatory towards the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. And there is no false memory syndrome. It's not in the psychiatric literature. It's not in the DSM-5. It's not in the DSM-4. It's just something that they came up with to justify Peter Fry molesting his daughter. And then it just grew.
Yeah.
Mind-boggling to me.
I mean, it's actually extraordinary that Ralph Wunderwager, managed to, be part of the essentially scientific board of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. And despite the fact that he'd given this lengthy interview to a Dutch pedophile magazine, which you've quoted it from, extolling the virtues of pedophilia. And I'd actually written about this in a journal in Australia, and it in turn published a response from Pamela Freud. Pamela, by the way, just for the record, Nick called me mean-spirited.
I had an interesting interaction with Pamela Freud. I called her and I said I wanted to set up an interview with her, and she was sweet as Tupelo honey to me. And then after we hung up, she obviously Googled me. And now the next time we talked, she wasn't very sweet. And actually, there was no interview.
Yeah, I know that's the experience of others. It's sort of interesting when one looks at the history of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. It started with a flourish. It had this invited board of some of whom were sort of luminaries like Aaron Beck, some of whom were sort of from the fringes of debunking sort of societies. Elizabeth Loftus was included. But, for the most part, most of them never said anything that I could see on anything to do with false memories. They allowed themselves to be invited onto this board, then sat there and contributed nothing to the debate. It did stimulate a lot of research on the nature of memory, the accuracy of memory, recovered memory versus non-recovered memory. And, the distillation of all of that is that, yes, people do have amnesias. Amnesia can be part of DID, obviously. And that the accuracy of memories that are so-called recovered versus memories that have always seemingly been there is about the same. Ross Chait at Brown University set up a long time ago a recovered memory project where he kept posting detailed accounts of individuals who in a verified way had amnesias, and where subsequently they recovered memories that were verified as being true. And within it's sort of interesting within psychiatry and within the history of post-traumatic stress disorders, we've always known about amnesias. It's been part of the operational criteria for the diagnosis of PTSD since there has been operational criteria, and battlefield amnesias have been common. We've known that particularly since World War II, where substantial percentage of soldiers exposed to verified battles of extreme trauma had partial or complete amnesia for the battle. Dissociation is not something just occurs in people who have been abused as children. While the manifestations may be slightly different in that the trauma occurs in someone who does have, a stable sense of adult identity before the trauma, nevertheless, very traumatized veterans will switch into altered states, or states in which they're back at the time of the battle, for example, and states in which they have amnesia for the battle. Yes, they may not have the extended grouping of alters that child abuse victims have, but in many other elements, their clinical presentations are similar. They somatize, they're prone to depression, anxiety, they self-medicate, they're prone to, use of drugs and alcohol, suicide attempts, self-harm, etc., etc. It's sort of interesting when one looks at the history of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. Yes, for a time in the early part, they had conferences, they encouraged people to sue therapists. They tried literally to outlaw therapists. They picked on particular therapists and drummed up charges, to be pursued by authorities. And there were a couple of, celebrated cases where, medical practitioners or health professionals, insurers caved rather than fight in court. So therefore there were high profile, adverse, settlements paid by insurance companies that didn't allow practitioners to offer a defense. So, it propagated the notion that, that there were crazy therapists out there in a wide scale way, encouraging the production of false memories. They, had conferences. They collected weird data, which they used to support the notion this was a widespread phenomena. False memories involving frequently in their allegations, therapists assuming satanic ritual abuse or assuming DID, and then conflating the two, and then trying to literally outlaw therapy on the basis of this sort of very selected few cases of where admittedly some people in the field unfortunately did go beyond the data. We get that in all fields where people think that they're at the cutting edge of something that's new and an insight into society's ills and over enthusiastically interpret what can be verified. It's kind of interesting. I think that from fairly early on, however, by the time we get to the sort of the late 90s, the tide was turning. We were beginning to become more and more aware of an increasing torrent of allegations involving organised abuse, particularly within the Catholic Church and by extension other churches. And then by 2002, the stream had become a flood when the Archdiocese of Boston, imploded with the verified news that over 10% of its priests were involved in the organised sexual abuse of children and its cover-up, and that the cover-up extended to the most senior Catholic official within the US, that's Cardinal Bernard Law, And, Time magazine ran with a cover article at that period, can the church survive? I think was the headline. And that says a lot, that suddenly we'd gone from, oh, there are all these people, creating false memories about satanic abuse, to, the largest church in the US actually being exposed as harboring and protecting large numbers of abusers. And of course, if more than 10% of the priests were actually involved as abusers, then it stands to reason that the rest of the priests would have to have been to some degree aware, and that at the senior level, the senior people were involved in moving these people around and avoiding scandals and prosecutions. And as we know, from that time onwards, there's been one investigation after another involving institutions, churches, but also sporting bodies and sporting identities. And, we've had, Jerry Sandusky and NASA from the gymnasts, and multiple swimming coaches who have been involved in the organised abuse of children, and organisations involved in protecting abusers. So the tide turned. The emphasis went away from people being falsely accused back to victims existing in society that had not been heard from. And in Australia, for example, by 2012, Julia Gillard was announcing the formation of a Royal Commission looking at institutional responses to child sexual abuse. And to my mind, the most thorough, functional investigation of its type thus far in world history. And it did it by one mechanism, by making the issues of the abuse survivors and their validation and dignity the central rock of their investigation. People who gave evidence felt heard. It's a funny thing, isn't it? Very simple. Allow victims to be heard, and to support them, and for the process to be safe. And that's what happened. And of course, that the Royal Commission found that within, for example, orders of brothers within the Catholic Church, there were a number where 20% approximately or more of the brothers had been involved in the sexual abuse of children. And at the most extreme, in the Brothers of St. John of God, it was over 40% of the brothers credibly involved in the sexual abuse of children. Now, when you've got any organisation where 40% of its members are sexually abusing children, I mean, what do you think was happening with the other 60%? Like they didn't know. And those sort of things are just sobering statistics that indicate society's extreme unwillingness, from Freud onwards, to grapple with this. But one point, getting back to the False Memory Syndrome Foundation and its advisory board, it's fairly clear that from pretty early on, from the late 90s onwards, that the False Memory Syndrome Foundation was becoming less and less of a functional body. And it was largely, as far as I can see, just an organisation that was held up, giving a public image, but largely by Pamela Freud. No one else in that grouping seemed to be very active at all.
Its members made hundreds of thousands of dollars flying around the world debunking child abuse.
Yeah, particularly Elizabeth Loftus. And her trajectory sort of, follows the trajectory of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. Yes, she made, a lot of money in the early days, but now by the time she got to the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, was becoming a figure of semi-ridicule, and also, with Harvey Weinstein, and the fact that she only appeared for the defense virtually was something that sort of caused amusement in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. It's kind of interesting when I look at, I followed the False Memory Syndrome Foundation website, and then back in sort of a late 2019, I became aware that a little note appeared saying that the thing was folding up at the end of the year. I think I was the first person in the ISSTD to realise that, in fact, it was over. The false memory syndrome had imploded. There was nothing left. It was all a front for many years for Pamela Freud to pretend there was an organisation and that was supported by an advisory committee, etc. But every time I checked, over previous years, the advisory committee would have these asterisks next to the names of an increasing number of members of their committee, and the asterisks indicated that they were now dead. It's the only society that I've ever seen where you have a committee, a central committee, where it got to the point where half of the members were deceased, and the average age of the remainder was well in the 80s. It kind of indicates that, in fact, that grouping was dead. And of course, they ended with the rationalisation that our work is done. But in fact, there was no one there doing much to support them. By the way, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation had its offshoots in other countries. The British one remains somewhat active. The Australian one, it became essentially dysfunctional and a non-entity many years ago. The last time they'd updated their website was 22 years ago. It was a budget website of a few pages, and that was it. It kind of gone, long since gone. Australians never got caught up with the polarizations that occurred in the US, for example. The leading exponent of a spokesperson for the Australian version, the Australian False Memory Society, was a psychiatrist, Jerome Gelb, who was initially exposed as a plagiarist, then in 2007 was arrested when he went into a Melbourne court with a loaded handgun and 43 rounds of ammunition. He, his wife and his living bodyguard were arrested. He was subsequently brought before the medical board in Victoria and suspended for firearms offences, and then subsequently brought before them again and suspended again, this time for having a sexual relationship with a patient who was now his ex-wife. But with that sort of leadership, it was sort of getting a hard message to sell in Australia.
The damage that it did, though, the way that the mainstream media embraced the False Memories Syndrome Foundation was amazing. In the book that I wrote, The Franklin Scandal, there was a pedophile priest named James Kelly. He had molested all kinds of kids in upstate New York. And then they moved him to Boys Town. And I thoroughly believe, I wasn't even looking for kids that got molested by him, but I came across like 8 of them. I was looking for kids that were part of that pedophile network. And then they moved him again to Las Vegas. And Harrison Pope, who is out of Harvard and a member of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, he debunked, this kid was obviously molested by Father Kelly. He had delayed memories of it, or dissociative amnesia. And and Father Kelly was a guy that should have been stopped many, many times. I mean, I believe that he molested scores and scores of children. But Harrison Pope went to bat for Boys Town and got dissociative amnesia thrown out of court. So Father Kelly continued to molest kids in Las Vegas. It did a lot of damage. Your field has been, first of all, there was Freud, and then it came under siege with False Memory Syndrome Foundation, but it's still standing, and you're still doing good work. Is there any closing comments that you can think of, Warwick?
Yes, I will, Nick. It's, we do get, and we have had various critiques from various sort of groupings. You've mentioned, people like the Satanic Temple, and we've also had, splinter groups on the DSM committees that have tried to expunge DID from the DSM with not much traction. But it's kind of interesting that you get these people that still there's always been some version, I suppose. But I mean, the one question that they never have a satisfactory answer to, you know, with respect to trauma and DID, is we now know, and I've, you know, I've written about this, you know, and it gain a credit to investigative journalists, and that in some cases that we now know many documented court cases of people being convicted for extraordinary, extreme, incestuous abuse of large numbers of children. And of course, worldwide attention was focused on Joseph Fritzl back in 2008, that, you know, he had sexually abused his daughter for 24 years in a dungeon and had abused her for 7 years prior to locking her up in a dungeon, exposed her to extreme sadism, risks of gassing, shooting, was obsessed with pornography, and yet outwardly was a businessman living in a nice multi-story house, driving a Mercedes-Benz, and was considered within the community as this grandfatherly type who had taken in the progeny of his wayward daughter, who was supposedly a member of a cult in Austria. The fact that no one ever could identify such a cult was kind of not given much credence at the time, but it exemplifies the, you know, verified extreme. I mean, what sort of mindset does it take to do what Joseph Fritzl did? And we know that it stimulated the reporting of similar cases all around the world. That became, you know, a foundation of one of my papers, which is looking at the press and court reports regarding verified extreme abuse by people who produced, in most cases, children and offspring from such incestuous abuse, all of which can be very verified. Now, everywhere, every person that I've ever seen, this is true, that has that sort of history, and my rough estimate, you know, going back to my original paper with Jeremy Butler in 1998, was that at least 1 in 8 of people with DID are people within the spectrum of ongoing incestuous abuse during adulthood, and that every one of those I've ever seen, and I've seen now, because I get asked for opinions and things, you know, fairly large number, probably, you know, in the region of 50 such individuals, including, you know, one new patient I was asked to assess 2 days ago. In every case, I have found that not only are they exposed to ongoing incestuous abuse, but that they've also been exposed to some variant of organised abuse, and whether it be multi-generational family abuse, church abuse, cult abuse, organised childhood prostitution, or sharing their abused child with abusive workmates. It's something I find fascinating, that it's sort of almost invariable in human behaviour. And it's also borne out by what we see with internet-based abuse. These people can't help themselves in getting together and sharing abuse and creating hierarchies of abuse within the abuse community. The fact that it is so widespread is indicative of the large numbers of people who frequent child sexual exploitation websites. And I mean, there's one case in Australia, a fellow called Shane McCool, you know, who was organised and running a worldwide child exploitation network where, you know, he and others conducted online, you know, live abuse of children. And, you know, he was working as a childcare officer. That says everything, that, you know, the ultimate cover, isn't it? Where, and we've seen this sort of thing, you know, repeatedly. We've also seen, as you know, senior, like there was one case in Canada of a senior church official who was negotiating, settlement from the abuses occurring within the Catholic institution, where he himself then subsequently became arrested for his involvement with child sexual exploitation online activity. So the guy that's a spokesman for the church negotiating a settlement and an apology for victims is actually himself carrying out abusive behaviours, and he himself was, convicted for that offence. So it goes back to Robert Fleiss, that we are surrounded by people who are before us and who exist in plain sight. Jimmy Savile, was the darling of, the media in the UK, was on friendly terms with the Prime Minister, had audiences, at times with the Queen, was friendly with Prince Charles, had great friendship with Ralph Harris. And yet we now know that, and he died before he was ever arrested. And we now know that at a minimum that there were 450 victims, spanning a period of over half a century. And what I do find is that these guys don't stop, and I find that with ongoing incest, the oldest I've come across where a member of the family is still doing it, he's doing it in his 90s, for God's sake.
It's interesting. Willie Sutton, he was a famous bank robber in the United States in the 40s and 50s. And he was asked, why do you rob banks? And he said, well, that's where the money is.
Yeah.
And that's why pedophiles
That's right. Yeah.
are attracted to institutions like Boys Town, because that's where their prey is. And it's been going on that way forever.
Yeah.
Well, Warwick, I really want to thank you for spending time with us and getting up early. And it's been a very, very enlightening interview.
Well, thank you, Nick. I actually wish you great success with this podcast series. And having watched your podcast with, Alicia Owen and Maria Farmer, I just take my hat off to the courage of such individuals who, and it takes rare courage to continue to speak the truth. Alicia Owen's journey is, an inspiration in terms of the human spirit. Really, this is like concentration camp, where you put in solitary for years for what? For telling the truth. And it says everything that most of the perpetrators associated with the Franklin scandal, skated free. It's deeply concerning. Like there was, I think, 19 deaths somehow associated with that scandal that got as brazen as, Gary Caradori's light plane being blown up, mid-air on a peaceful night where there was no rain, no storms, and where the briefcase that he's carrying his evidence was never recovered from the crash site. And I think the back seats as well, which we assume is kind of highly indicative of there being some sort of bomb on board the plane, an explosion followed by a plane falling apart in midair on a peaceful night. It's pretty unusual. And it's, and Maria Farmer, the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, I think it's, there's 2 deaths so far. There's Jeffrey Epstein and Jean-Luc Brunel, that we know of, yes. And again, it would seem that there are hundreds of victims, and it's fascinating that we're dealing with an abuse grouping. Well, key members of that grouping had close associations with not one but 2 American presidents on both sides of politics. It seems very apparent from multiple sources that Bill Clinton visited Little St. James, Epstein's weird private island. And of course, it's very apparent that Epstein, for a time had a close association with Donald Trump. And yet, it cannot be other than the fact that there are multiple other people involved from what we know. And yet it's kind of interesting that, all these decades on that we're still kind of waiting for, as with Franklin, for the full story to be told. But you know, the interest of parties that need protection is an obvious reason that there is such reluctance, particularly when the investigation in Epstein, you know, was torpedoed in early on at a very high level, such that some weird plea deal was done that cut the then known victims completely out of the court proceedings. And we still the system that you have is still in the US is still not addressed that issue. But I do applaud the Australian Royal Commission. I think in the history of the world, I can't think of any commission of inquiry looking at organised abuse that did a better job. Yes, there were things that it didn't do, but you could say that about any inquiry. But it's a rare inquiry that meets community expectations, and an even rarer inquiry that exceeds community expectations. And that was an initiative of Julia Gillard, a recipient of the same award that you've recently had bestowed. So, and she's also, you know, a strong advocate at a political level in respect to, you know, mental health and abuse issues.
Well, thank you so much. And
yep.
Have yourself a great day.